Hi, so my name is Guillermo Molina. Some of you know me. I am an animation supervisor slash director at Lone Coconut. I've been having a few talks with Tom Mikota, which is the mastermind behind Lumber Mill, or pipeline at Lone Coconut. And we were talking about the stuff that I know about pipeline and how I learned them. We developed this thing called Lumber Mill by Tom, and throughout that journey of developing that software, I definitely learned a lot of things, and I just wanted to dump that into a video, and hopes that that video would be something that if someone else saw it, they'll understand what I learned throughout this process that Tom obviously knows because he's an expert in the area, but me as an animation person, I had to go through that process to learn that. I studied to be a 3D animator, not pipeline 2D. So, yeah. So this is a long video. I didn't have time to make a short version of it, so I'm making a long one. So basically, what is pipeline? Well, I don't know. I don't know what pipeline is. I don't have a good definition for it. I just know that I want to make a film. So I just know that I want to make a film, and within that films, there are things that I need to prepare. Those are assets, and those are props, and those are definitely environments where things happen. And then those things get, in a way, used in a bunch of shots. And those shots are, belong to also a little bit of a hierarchy. So I guess that all of a sudden you come to realize that there are these two buckets of things, which are in a way the shots, and then you have the bucket which is the assets. And the assets go into the shots. That's all I can tell you about that. This was a little house, by the way. So then, cool. So the logic would dictate that we create an asset, for example, a character, and then we prepare that character to, maybe we have to sculpt it, we have to give it bones or rig it, and we need to apply the materials or shade it. And maybe we need to draw some details, and we have some other tasks in there. But for the most part, let's just stick with those three. And if we have these three tasks, then I guess that those three tasks are gonna have versions. And well, I guess that before that, you would assign that to someone. So for example, Guillermo. And then I'm gonna have versions of that. And then you might have multiple people in that task. So I guess that the really interesting thing about this, or the interesting challenge, then becomes, let's say that you have a short film that's 15 minutes, and you're gonna have maybe 15 scenes, and each of those scenes is gonna be a minute long. If you have an average of around 10 shots a minute, those are 150 shots. I know, I'm really good at math. So those 150 shots, and like the assets are, like this is the asset, the shot part of it, which we'll get back to. But let's say that those are my shots, and then within my assets, if we have 3 tasks, and those are gonna go through iterations. Let's say that each of them goes through 10 iterations, right? So that is 30 versions for each of those, and we need to manage. This is just one asset, and all of these versions that we need to manage, and those are gonna have to come in here. So these are shots. Now let's say that instead of one asset, we end up with 50 assets. Then all of a sudden, you can see how this being, 1,500 files is a little bit of a challenging or an interesting or thing to manage. Now, if that wasn't complicated enough, then we're gonna have to connect these things, because once you sculpt it, you need to rig it, and once you rig it, you need to shade it, or maybe you want to sculpt it and then shade it and then rig it. So I guess that to summarize this first part, all you need to know is there's a lot to manage. A lot of files. Now, that's the first thing. The other thing you need to know, or that I learned, is that each process has its own requirements. I'm gonna stop trying to write this if it's not illustrating anything. So, since each process has its own requirements, what happens is that you need to figure out a way to make it so that once I sculpt my thing, when I want to rig it and add a little bone to it, the guy on the rigging task has the necessary things for him to do his job. So if you're going to say that this is a 3-step process, the guy that's going to model it, the guy that's going to rig it, and then the guy that's going to shade it, the guy that needs to model needs to have his references. Then the rigger needs for this mesh to be cleaned up and do something with that. And then the guy that's going to shade it also needs a few things. And just making sure that each of these files, once you're done, and once you're done doing your art and you're about to pass that into the next person, figuring out what that next person needs, it's kind of like an impossible task, because the other person is in a different area and you're an expert on this area. So how are you supposed to know what this guy needs? And what happens if what this guy needs changes? How do you manage that? So I guess I'm gonna get better at summarizing this. But the second thing you need to know, so the first thing is there's a lot of files. The second thing I learned and I need to know is processes have requirements. And it's hard to manage those requirements. So the third thing I learned is that once you're working on your file and your asset, one thing happens that's kind of interesting, which is that you find yourself doing tasks over and over again. And if you plot out the time that's being spent, I think you're gonna find out that there's a good chunk, I would say, in my experience, around 60% of the time that it's used, well, not creating art. And what happens is that figuring how to optimize that with tools so that you can figure out, well, which are the parts of the process that maybe we can do something different and automate, so that you turn that 60% into 15%, it's really important. So I guess the third thing I learned was that we waste a lot of time. We're doing things that like saving files and renaming stuff and moving things around and sending your art for review. So those are all things that take a lot of time and that they're really, really unproductive. So with those three things that I learned, I guess that the goals is, one, we need to figure out how to manage the files. 2, we need to if we go back here, we have every process has a require, so we need to figure out how to fix things that, well, for the next process. And 3, we need to automate the boring stuff. And if we can do that, what happens is that all of a sudden you are making a film and not worrying about the elements of making a film. And then what I learned was that in order to manage the files, you need to have a structure that's going to be really good at managing that. So the way Tom has structured it, and which I think is really cool, is first you divide it by assets and shots. Then for each of those, you figure out, well, what do you usually do with those things? And for assets, as we've discussed before, you have modeling, you have shading, you have rigging, but you might also have something like a reference, which is also something you do within an asset. And then for shots, you do a layout, or you place the camera and the elements. You have animation, you have lighting, and you have comp. You put all that together. And then for each of those tasks, so for example, if we take modeling, as we've discussed before, we're gonna have different people and we're gonna move things around. So you wanna have a folder structure that in essence is gonna allow you to grab this modeling and assign it to people and then manage the versions and then manage how you're gonna pass that file to other people. And most importantly, the file that you're working on, this is your working file. It's different than the file that you give to someone else. So if you're modeling, this might be a blend file. And if you are passing that along, depending on who you're passing it to, you might give them maybe an OBJ or an FBX. But if you're sending that to the shading or the guy that's going to do the shading, then all he wants is to know the, I guess, the materials. And that's something that you could define on your modeling. And then you can just give this guy a JSON file, which is a text file with the materials that you want. But then you might want to give that blend file to the rigger. So it all depends on who's going to have. So the best way to do that is actually to divide, I guess, your files into 2 folders, and one's going to be source and the other one's going to be render. And what that means is that you may have one source file, which is a blend file, and then you are going to have a bunch of files on the render, and that might be a JSON, an FBX, it could be an OBJ, or really any type of thing you may want to give out. You may have a render, so a JPEG sequence or an EXR for that. Maybe you want even, I don't know, an MOV here. And then the other aspect is that each of these, I guess that in a way, you need to specify, now that we have JPEGs and EXRs and MOVs, and now we have blend files and different versions of this asset, you want to specify a little bit of how you're giving that out. Is it a high res, or is it a proxy, or a low res? And I guess that that's a little bit of the other thing I learned, which is that you can have these different versions of these files in these different configurations, and it has the same information, it's just represented in a different way. So we need to figure out how to manage the files. That is dividing it by asset shots, and then figuring out for each of these tasks, and these are all tasks. These are all tasks. We need to figure out how to organize it so that you have your work in progress area, and then your, I guess, the tray that you hand out to the other people. And we do that by dividing it into source and renders. And the really convenient way of doing that is actually having two identical paths that just have different contexts. So we have the context that's source, and the context that's render. I'm not getting into file paths right now, but just know that if this is your project, or if this is your company, or your school, or your project, then on source you're gonna have your project, and on render you're gonna have your project, and these paths are gonna, like the paths on the bottom, are gonna mimic the paths on the top. So identically for whatever it is that you're doing, so that if at any point on your source file you want to tell it, hey, just give the stuff to someone else, you just move it to the path on the bottom, like the same file, but you just have to change source for render. And that's kind of cool, because at any point and you have your files separated in two different bins that don't get, well, sorry for the redundancy, but don't get mixed. Now, if we have figured out how to manage the files, then how do we fix the things for the next process? And I guess that this is where the flight checks come in. And a flight check is when you're about to fly on a plane, you know how the pilot goes, hey, do we have lights? Yeah, check. We have landing gear. Check. And then we have something else, which I don't know the technicality for. Check. If all of these are true, then we are ready for takeoff, and we can get out of this airport. Me driving this analogy. So yeah, like taking that analogy, I guess that once you're done with your file and the director is happy, this is my director, then once that's approved and you can pass that to someone else, the cool thing would be to have an automated checklist that in a way is your virtual assistant for the next process. And having that, it's kind of like a no-brainer when you start to make these processes a little bit more complicated. Because if you remember in here, we were talking about this impossible task of figuring out the requirements for the next person without having the expertise. Well, that's kind of solved here because this spec sheet can be written by the expert. And then you, as an artist, only have to worry about passing your thing through this checklist. And then for the next person that gets it, it's also going to be a happy trooper because they won't waste any time like telling you what you need to have. You'll just have it. So I guess that this magical checklist of things is what's called the pre-flight window. And that pre-flight window has, well, you guessed it, pre-flights. And those are literally check normals. Or they could be check file name. Or they can be create MOV or create FBX. And those are things that if you have in there and if they automatically get made, then you never have to worry about it. And each of these, what we found was that, well, it is kind of a pain in the ass to, I guess, program and do all these things. So what Tom came up with was a way to program that in a nice window where you would just say, well, which software are you in? And you can say, oh, I'm in Blender. Okay, so this is a pre-flight list for which process? And you can tell it, well, I'm in modeling. Cool, so what do you want to do? I want to check the normals. Well, before that, I guess that you ask Blender, and what do you want to do? Yeah, so I want to check the normals. And then you just, I guess, paste the instructions for what you want. And every single time you pass that to someone else, it's just gonna do this thing that you asked it to do. And it's gonna make sure that your normals are good. And if it's good, it's gonna pass. And if not, it's gonna tell you, dude, that's not quite right. And it's either gonna try to fix it, and if it can, it's just gonna tell you, I can't fix it, you fix it. So that's kind of cool. And this automated process of creating this list is the, I guess, it's called the pipeline designer. And these are the pre-flights. And what happens, that I don't know why I wrote pre-flights like that. What happens is that in this pipeline designer, not only can you specify these pre-flight steps, but you can also automate other stuff. And that leads me to the last part of this, which is automating the boring stuff. So every single time you're repeating a task, that's kind of like a red flag, and that is an opportunity to basically automate that. And I get that sometimes code, that like this is where the C word comes in, coding. And I guess that you don't need to be an expert in coding to, or know any code in order for you to think about this automatization. The only thing you need to be aware is, if I'm repeating a task over and over again, can I explain that to someone? Because if you can tell, like if you're renaming objects or if you're moving things around all the time, if you can explain that to me or someone else on your team and that knows coding, and you tell it, listen, I just spent a lot of time renaming controllers, or sometimes I want to change the shape of a controller from the default to a box, and that takes, if I want to do a lot of them, that's kind of a pain in the ass. And then I can tell you, okay, so what is the process? And you can explain to me, well, I just select the shape, then I go to this menu and I add another thing, and then I associate it with this thing, And if you can record a video of that, of how you're doing it, the chances are we can code something that's gonna take this 3-step process or this 10-step process and turn it into one button. And that way you just have to figure out a way. You just have to click this thing and tell it which shape you want to do. And all of a sudden, not only do you not have to worry about this shape and then renaming it and then fixing the color, you just have to click this button. And it's going to take us a little bit of time to figure out this connection. But everyone should be aware of the fact that the software, a software like Blender or a software like Maya or Houdini or anywhere you're at, it's kind of like a sandbox, like an empty sandbox. And it's designed so that you have tools to build things inside that sandbox, but they don't know which tools you want. So it is our job to build those tools. And to come back to this pipeline designer thing, I guess that the creation of those tools, it's also made super quickly so because all of the processes that we need to do, for example, this checklist, if you remember, we had something like check normals. Well, I guess that can be just a button that says check normals. And we can plug that into a menu, or we can plug that into a pre-flight. And that's awesome because with the same code, these two get connected, and that's kind of how Lumbermill works, where you only have to put the code in here and it figures out how to turn that into a menu and how to turn that into a pre-flight automatically. Not only that, but if you wanted to turn that into maybe another type of thing like a context menu or a search bar, you could also turn that into something else. And if you do that enough times, what happens is that you end up with a really nice pipeline. And I guess that these 30 minutes were all to say the combination of these things is pipeline, is how things connect, how you have the different types of assets, how you need to divide the combination of files, where they come from and where they go, and then connecting all of that in a way that is easy to follow and that it is maintainable. So to finish with what I learned on this process, I learned that in order to do all those things, you need to have core tools that let you basically create those menus a lot easier and a lot faster. I learned that you need to have review tools within those core tools, and that is going to be the thing that where you can click and someone can see your work. I learned that within those core tools, you need to figure out the interconnectivity between processes, which at the first level is within the software, but then you need to figure out how that connects to other softwares. So, for example, Nuke, because obviously Nuke needs a different input than Blender. Yeah, and then you need to figure out all those connections all over the place and try to automate the board and stuff. So yeah, I guess in the spirit of not making these any longer, that's all I know about pipeline, and it's probably not all I know about pipeline, but I guess it's all I didn't know as a fundamental before starting, that had I known, maybe I would have seen things different from the get-go. So So yeah, that's about it.